I've always been drawn to the forgotten places, the abandoned, the isolated, the silent. I'm a seasoned solo hiker and urban explorer, finding my destinations in the obscure corners of online forums. Until this trip, the woods had always felt like a sanctuary. Now, 4 months later, they feel like a trap I barely escaped. I found the location on a dead subreddit. A user with zero history had posted about a cluster of hidden caves, maybe 10 to 15 openings, deep in a remote national forest. The post had no traction, no comments, and only vague coordinates. It required a 4-mile hike down an unmaintained dirt road just to reach the trailhead, which was nothing more than a dead end swallowed by the tree line. When I arrived, the isolation was immediate and oppressive. It wasn't the peaceful solitude of nature, it was a heavy, suffocating silence. The forest felt unnaturally still, like a held breath. A few hours into the hike, the dense trees opened into a small clearing. Right in the center sat a tent. It was medium-sized, slumped on one side, covered in grime and pine needles. The rainfly was torn, flapping lazily in the non-existent wind. The zipper was torn open. There was no campfire ring, no gear, no sign of life. Just a dirty, abandoned shell. An abandoned tent is one of the most disturbing things you can find in the wild. It takes time to set up a tent, and it takes time to pack it. You don't leave it behind unless you have to leave right now. You only abandon your shelter if staying inside it is more dangerous than running into the dark. I should have turned back then. I didn't. I pushed past the clearing toward the rock face the OP had mentioned. The caves were there, dark gashes in the stone. Most were too small to enter, but one was large, obscured by thick brush. I clicked on my high-powered flashlight and stepped inside. The wide mouth quickly narrowed into a claustrophobic tunnel, the stone walls slick with moisture. The beam of my light reached far, but it was swallowed by absolute impenetrable blackness. I took 3 steps before my stomach dropped. The air pressure changed. It felt thick, heavy, almost electric. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out. I backed out slowly. As I stood by the entrance, trying to shake the dread, a sound echoed from deep within the cave. It was a wet, distorted noise, a horrific hybrid of a hyena's laugh and a human scream. It echoed off the stone, amplifying until it sounded like it was right next to my ear. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like something trying to sound like an animal. I didn't wait. I practically ran back to the trail. I hiked for another hour, constantly checking over my shoulder, convinced the trees were watching me. When the sun began to set, I forced myself to set up camp just off the trail. No fire, no noise. I just wanted the night to end. I lay in my sleeping bag for hours, staring at the nylon ceiling. Then, around midnight, a new, suffocating wave of terror hit me. It was a primal, paralyzing discomfort, the unmistakable feeling of being hunted. I didn't want to look outside. I knew what the darkness held, but the tension was unbearable. My hand shook as I reached for the zipper. I pulled it down just an inch and peered out. 20 feet down the trail, illuminated only by the faint starlight, someone was standing. My heart seized. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw another shape, and another. There was a loose group of people, maybe 5 or 6, standing completely motionless in the dark, facing my tent. They weren't hikers. They didn't have flashlights or gear. They were just standing there, silent sentinels in the pitch black. I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing only my backpack. The moment I moved, I saw their heads slowly turn, tracking me in unison. I backed away down the trail, never taking my eyes off them. Once they faded into the dark, I turned and sprinted. I hiked 4 miles in absolute darkness, the feeling of eyes burning into my back the entire way. I never saw them again, but I heard the occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves keeping pace with me in the brush. I don't know who they were. I don't know what happened to the owner of that abandoned tent. But I know this. If I had walked deeper into that cave, I would have become a permanent resident of that forest. We thought we were kings of the wilderness. My friends Corey, Tyler, and I were college kids looking for freedom, so we hiked 5 hours deep into the Montana backcountry to a completely isolated spot at the base of a mountain. The first night was perfect. We drank, we laughed, we stoked a massive fire, feeling invincible. Around 1 a.m., we crawled into our tents, exhausted and happy. An hour later, my bladder woke me up. I unzipped my tent and stumbled 30 feet into the pitch black woods to relieve myself. When I finished, I turned back toward the campsite and my breath caught in my throat. Someone was standing in the trees. My eyes strained in the dark. It looked like Tyler. He was standing perfectly still, facing away from the camp, staring into the absolute black void of the forest. Tyler? I whispered, walking toward him. What are you doing? He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. I walked right up to him and peered at his face. His eyes were wide open, but they were blank, empty, and devoid of any human spark. He looked like a mannequin. Tyler, let's go back, I said, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed his jacket, he snapped violently back to reality. He whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, unreadable expression. Fear? Rage? Then, just as quickly, his face went blank. He turned and marched back to his tent, zipping it shut without a word. The next morning, neither Tyler nor Corey remembered anything. Tyler acted completely normal, laughing and joking. I convinced myself it was just a creepy episode of sleepwalking. But that evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountain, we were scattered around the camp collecting firewood. Corey yelled a joke, and I called out to Tyler for his reaction. Silence. I turned and found Tyler standing at the edge of the camp, staring out into the woods again, frozen in the exact same posture as the night before. Corey saw it too. We walked up to him, calling his name repeatedly. When we were inches away, Tyler suddenly snapped out of it, looking at us with genuine confusion. What do you want? He asked, completely oblivious to the fact that we had been shouting his name for 2 minutes. He had no memory of spacing out. I looked past him into the woods, but there was nothing, just shadows. We went to bed around midnight. I tossed and turned for hours, a gnawing dread keeping me awake. At 3 a.m., nature called again. The forest was dead silent. I unzipped my tent and looked out. There, in the exact same spot at the edge of the woods, a figure was standing. Tyler, seriously, man, what are you doing? I muttered, walking toward him. I got halfway there when I stopped dead in my tracks. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The figure was facing me. It wasn't Tyler. The shoulders were too broad, the posture too rigid. It was staring directly at me from the shadows. Before I could scream, I felt a heavy hand clamp down on my shoulder. I whipped around, terrified. It was Corey. He looked panicked. Dude, are you okay? Corey whispered fiercely. I heard you calling Tyler's name, but you weren't responding to me. I stared at Corey, my mind fracturing. I was the one sleepwalking? But when I turned back to the woods, the figure was gone. We have to leave, I told Corey, my voice shaking. Right now. Someone is watching us. We woke Tyler up, and strangely, Pete didn't argue. He packed his gear in silence, his eyes darting toward the tree line. We hiked out in the dead of night, navigating by the weak beams of our flashlights, every snapping twig sounding like a gunshot. A year later, Tyler still claims he never saw anything. He swears he wasn't sleepwalking. But I know what I saw in the dark, and I know the figure that was standing in the woods wasn't a sleepwalker. It was the thing Tyler had been staring at all along. The property I bought sounded like a dream on paper. 50 acres of dense, untouched forest bordering a vast state owned wilderness. My house sat at the very edge of the map, the last point of civilization before the topography turned into a tangled, jagged mess of ravines and ancient hemlocks. I was a novice camper, but I loved the quiet. I'd grab my gear, hike about 30 minutes into the brush, and set up a small, humble clearing to escape the noise of the world. It was late October, the season of dead leaves and early shadows, when I decided to head out for one final overnight trip before the first snow. I found a decent spot, cleared a ring for a fire, and had just finished pitching my tent when the silence of the woods was broken. A man stepped out from behind a thicket of spruce. He was in his mid 20s, average height, but his appearance triggered a primal warning alarm in my brain. His hair was long, slick, and oily. It looked like it had been soaking in grease for weeks, plastered against his skull in dark, wet strands. He looked frantic, his eyes darting around my camp with a twitchy, manic energy. "Hey," he said, his voice a dry, hollow rattle. "Am I close to the Forest Service road?" I pointed back toward the north. "Not really. You've got about 5 miles of rough terrain before you hit the main track." He didn't thank me. He just stood there for a heartbeat, his head tilted at an odd angle, and then muttered, "Okay," before turning and vanishing back into the wall of trees. I watched him go, feeling a strange, lingering dread. I didn't even notice until he was gone that I had been standing with my hand in my pocket, my thumb hooked firmly around the handle of my folding knife. I wasn't a fearful person, but something about him had felt wrong. Like he wasn't looking for a road, but looking for something to do. I spent the afternoon trying to ignore the sensation of eyes on my back. As the sun sank, painting the sky in bruises of purple and charcoal, I lit a small fire. The woods grew unnaturally still. Usually at dusk, you hear the woods coming alive. Crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals. That night, the forest was a vacuum. Absolute, stifling silence. At 9:30 p.m., I was sitting by the dying embers when a voice cut through the dark. "Hello?" It came from the absolute blackness about 100 feet in front of me. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. It sounded exactly like the man with the oily hair, the same dry, emotionless rasp. But he sounded different, too. He sounded like he was in agony. "Hey, I'm here. Can you help me?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello?" The voice called again. It was closer. I stood up, gripping my flashlight, and pushed away from the fire. As I stepped into the dark, the man's voice called my name. My name. I stopped. I hadn't told him my name. No one knew I was out here. "Who's there?" I shouted, swinging my light into the trees. The light caught him. He was standing in the middle of a small opening, staring directly at me. I could see his outline, the hunched posture, the way he stood, but my light didn't reveal his face. It just seemed to sink into the darkness surrounding him. "Am I close to the Forest Service road?" he asked. It was the exact same question, but it wasn't just the words, it was the tone. It was a perfect mechanical copy of his voice from earlier. Every syllable, every inflection, the dryness, the utter lack of emotion, it was identical, like a recording played on a loop. A wave of nausea washed over me. I looked closer, trying to focus my light through the thicket. And then The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The man in front of me was tall. He was massive. He had no hair hanging down his shoulders. He was an entirely different shape than the man I'd met at noon. I was staring at something that had seen me interact with the first man and was now trying to become him. You aren't him, I whispered, the panic finally overriding my shock. The thing in the woods didn't move. It just repeated the question again, voice perfectly flat, perfectly dead. Am I close to the Forest Service road? Then it began to move. It didn't walk, it drifted toward me, its limbs jerking in that same twitchy, unnatural rhythm. It began to call out my name again. My name, his name, the question, all layered on top of each other, a discordant, shifting mess of audio that sounded like a human trying to learn how to speak. I didn't pack. I didn't zip the tent. I turned and sprinted. I ran until my lungs burned like they were filled with broken glass. I ran until I saw the porch light of my own house flickering in the distance. I locked myself inside, bolted the doors, and sat in the dark with a weapon until the sun rose. When I went back the next day with 2 armed friends, my camp was untouched. My tent was standing, my backpack was sitting on the log, and my knife was exactly where I'd left it. But I found something else. In the mud, just where that thing had been standing, there were no boot prints. There were just deep, circular indentations, like a heavy tripod had been pressed into the earth. And inside the fire ring, the logs hadn't been burned by wood. They were charred with a black, oily substance that smelled exactly like the man's greasy hair. I moved out of that house 3 weeks later. I don't go to the woods anymore. I don't trust the dark. And whenever I hear someone calling my name from the tree line, I don't look back. I know better now. I know that some things in the forest aren't lost. They're just waiting for you to answer them.